People think that authority is a very perishable thing, and if somebody else tries to do something that you think you're supposed to do, you have less. And so therefore, I'm going to make sure that I'm in charge of this and people know it.
I'm the boss, I'm the leader. I'm supposed to have the answers. I'm supposed to tell people what to do. And they forget that they're in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world where that kind of thinking is just counterproductive. It's at odds with reality.
What's a leader on a Navy ship? You are trying to empower your people to make good decisions, to use your vessel as a unit of national diplomacy. So I don't think making decisions in a vacuum or creating a culture where people are scared to talk to you is the best way to go about it.
When it's all said and done, you do rely on the team to communicate concerns, things not operating the way they would expect them to operate rather rapidly.
You need to understand that even the junior sailor has the opportunity to save the whole team by just speaking up, and you need to indoctrinate that into culture.
That is really important for a safety culture to actually work its way down from leaders to actual job task performance.
It's a team effort, and so one of the big takeaways from the Fitzgerald is make sure that there's free lines of communication between different parts of the ship that have pieces of situation awareness, pieces of the tactical picture.
So how do I continue to find different ways to prime them and to make sure that they're a part of the conversation? Because that's really what makes us effective.
We should all be iterating on however we lead and trying to refine that process to make it as effective as possible.
And that sometimes is a tough transition for some of our folks.
I think it is a common dilemma that leaders face, that they sort of put too much on themselves.
That, from a safety standpoint, is a very risky proposition.
I think we're still running the military, not just in the Navy, but in each of the services, by our fathers' and grandfathers' set of principles. We have a different generation now, and you have to recognize that in the way you provide for them.
Maritime industry has 10,000 years of the captain being the all-knowing, all-authoritative person. And so there is an amazing amount of tradition and inertia in overcoming this hierarchy.
The myth of leadership is of the single heroic leader. That's what people think about a leader, and that's the leaders have to be responsible. I'm responsible, so therefore I need to make the decisions. Without realizing that when they do that and isolate themselves, they're in a sense making themselves stupid. The leader is denying themselves that information, that perspective, which in a complex world where you're worried about system failures, which have precursors, he's not going to see.
They'll say, don't bring me the problem unless you can also bring me the solution. And there's a big problem with that notion. Some folks who see a problem don't know what the solution will be. And if you're saying, don't tell me the problem unless you can bring me a solution, the result is you're just not going to get notified of those problems.
I think many, many senior officers have the experience at some point in their commanding officer tour. One of those sailors is going to turn to him at one point and say, Captain, why are you doing that? Or did you know that you're doing this? Typically when the captain is not in the best, most receptive mood. And those are the things that have both saved the captain's career, which is interesting, but kept the ship off the rocks.
We see in military organizations these kind of twin impulses. One is that we will get better if we get into higher compliance, if we can train people more effectively in specific procedures. And for cut and dried, what we call technical problems, that kind of command and control, high compliance orientation does actually produce high performance. In the circumstances of these mishaps, what you notice is that people were suddenly plunged into circumstances that were different than they expected. And they had trouble figuring out how to respond. The question is, what are the things that you need to do or say? What conditions do you need to set as a leader for us to be successful in both of these environments?
There's two factors. The one is the senior personnel have to create the environment in which junior personnel feel comfortable speaking up. I also think, and this is the harder part, it requires courage from the junior person to speak up.
As the commanding officer of a ship, you want your sailors to feel comfortable calling you about anything, anytime, anywhere, to enable you to help them make good decisions. That's your job. Every single interaction you have, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on that ship, is shaping their decision of whether or not they want to call you.
How do you ensure you're striking that balance? How do you ensure that you're giving folks the approachability from the standpoint of they're going to be comfortable enough to provide you feedback or that forceful backup, or they're going to have the questioning attitude and not worry about the recourse of having that questioning attitude when it involves safety? What you find in leadership a lot of times, it's highly contextual.
And that's a big interest of mine, right? I call it psychological safety. How do you design, lead, manage, and occupy organizations in a way that people know that they're always supposed to just err on the side of, let's check, let's speak up, let's say something, let's ask for help. And there's a direct line between psychological safety and failure prevention.
One of the issues we find is what we call power distance, that the farther apart two people are in their perceived place in hierarchy, the less apt that junior person is to speak up, and also the less apt the senior person is to listen to the junior person.
And both of those require a pretty consistent, constant effort and a focus on not just accountability, which is critical in our business, but also this idea of how we're going to learn from this, which necessarily supposes that the person at the deck plate is the expert, not the captain.
That might not fit the mold of what we imagine captains and navies were in the 1600s. But with how technical our systems are, our ships are, there's no way a captain's going to be the most knowledgeable person on any ship about every single system. So they need that team to help them understand the decisions that they're making.
The khakis, the chiefs, the officers, they have to be receptive to those things coming from the junior enlisted and realize that, hey, these are the people that are actually working in this area day to day, every day. That junior person might see something that somebody else doesn't see. That junior person might see what somebody else thinks is normal. So everybody needs to bring up anything that they see or think they see to maintain the safety of the ship and each other.
This isn't about being nice or being humble or giving up your role or your power or your authority. It's about making sure you behave in ways that allow others to do what they need to do for safe operations. That's your responsibility.
Everybody is a safety officer in a sense. Everybody has responsibility for the safety of the organization, not only just what they do, but what they see and what they communicate that they've seen. But in order for that to happen, you have to have a system that's receptive.
That may be as simple as using the right tone of voice. It may be as simple as if a junior person speaks up, perhaps the thing they spoke up about is not a concern, but ensuring that they still feel valued in providing that feedback. We've also had accidents where the senior member is so well respected that the junior member assumes that the senior member knows what they're doing or the senior member has got the situation handled, and so they don't speak up. Even the most respected commanders can fall victim to this because perhaps they're almost an over-reliance on their expertise by the junior members.
When we use the word leadership, we don't mean just the exercise of authority. We mean the ability to influence the outcomes that are going to take place as a result of what we are doing. So by that definition, leadership can happen at any level in the organization, and it can happen with or without authority. And actually, one of the more interesting features of successful organizations is the ability of people who don't have authority to exercise leadership, and for us to take account of that, to hear it, and to respond to it.
Everyone knows that no one's infallible. Everyone makes mistakes. But to openly admit that and welcome feedback, you're going to have more resilient teams. You're going to avoid making decisions in a vacuum. When you enable and empower the most junior people on your ship to say, hey, that doesn't look right, Captain. Maybe we should think about this, sir.
So, yes, commanding a ship is wonderful, interesting, and potentially glorious. And you will not be very successful at that unless you kind of have this sense of humility and the ego is invested in those people, their development, and what they know is the single most important thing, particularly when we're talking about mishaps.
The second thing is just when leaders and everyone else, but especially leaders, are asking genuine questions of others, like, what are you seeing? What are you thinking? What are you worried about? What are you excited about? And then, of course, listening to the responses, that starts to build that environment of psychological safety.
And the idea that, well, the way I operate that is that I'm in command and I'm the answer giver. And if anybody has a question, they should bring me their question. And why are you asking me that question again? That doesn't sound like a very good way to set conditions that are going to be successful in these more novel components. That may work pretty well for you as long as we stay in complete control. But one of the things that we know for sure is that you can't stay in complete control 100% of the time.
So what I talk to commanding officers and others about is, as you walk around the ship, who talks to you about what? And most of the time, folks find that sailors wait for an opportunity, but if you give them an opportunity, you'll hear things maybe you didn't even want to. But incredibly valuable information.
Minesweepers make that really easy because we don't teach our cadre of SWOs very much about that warfare community. So to walk into a ship where you're the executive officer, the second in command essentially, and say, hey, teach me about what you do. I don't understand it as well as you do. It just immediately changes the dynamic. It starts building trust.
We're all in this together. Whatever it is that we're going to face it together. Whatever adversity we have to get through, I've got your back. That's how you build that sense of trust. And then connectedness, people really need to know, for one, that they're making a difference, that this whole enterprise that we're working on is going toward the greater good. You know, there's the old story of the person sweeping the floor at NASA, and somebody comes by and asks them what they're doing, and they say, well, I'm trying to put a man on the moon.
What leaders are trying to create or must create is a sense of shared understanding of what's at stake. Day in and day out, all of us should be just a little bit on our toes because of the complexity of the system we're working in. Coupled with that awareness, that shared awareness, that explicit awareness, is purpose, why it matters that we're out here. Those are two things that will make it easier for me to do hard stuff, right? Like speaking up.
You know, I like the way that Amy Edmondson talks about these are complementary ideas, psychological safety and accountability. And you need a lot of both. And that's when you'll have a very high-performing team who learns quickly. And when something doesn't go right, we need to very quickly go down to a very flat organization. So the ability to do that takes some practice. And the reason it exists or not is how well leadership enforces that construct. And you may have a perfectly open, amenable, fabulous, approachable commanding officer and a real asshole somewhere down the line. And any person along that way can squelch that.
The organization does care, but again, I'm not going to sugarcoat or lie. You will still encounter a bad leader. You will still find a leader who will say to you, you're just trying to get out of work. There's nothing wrong with you. I've had worse experiences. You're just weak. You just don't want to do what you have to do. And I would like to believe there are fewer of those people around, but it does happen.
There's also retaliation that happens. Oh, you're tired? Oh, okay, yeah, go take a half-hour nap and then you're put on double duty. They understand what pushes people's buttons and what doesn't.
We want a ready fleet that can execute whatever mission they're asked to do. And honestly, we can undermine that if we don't support them with the resources they need, whether that be sleep or nutrition or monitoring.
We've got to learn. Because again, if we don't, the error is carried forward. It's lessons observed, not lessons learned.
Following the comprehensive review, we put together our own review to try to figure out two things. One is, are we actually getting any better? Is our mishap rate improving? And in sheer numbers, yes, but I wasn't convinced that our mishap rate was actually improving. And I was not convinced that our solutions were having the desired effect. So to be tangible, particularly for the surface force, we finally took a step back and said, all right, so we're done trying to determine causal and contributory. Let's just talk about what it was like on a mishap ship on a mishap day. What are the things that were in common? It's not nuclear power or rocket science. These are very common sense things. The other one was, hey, if I was a commanding officer and I had these in my pocket and I was walking around my ship, I could kind of score myself, see if those things existed on my ship. Yeah, people didn't follow the procedures, but it was never just one person. There was always a decision involved. We could pretty much prove that they knew what they were supposed to do, but they decided not to do it that way, and not on the day of the mishap. It'd been that way for a while. And, the impulse for many in the surface community, myself included, is, well, they must be a guilty bastard because there's an integrity issue here. But that's not true. They had made a risk decision, and not one person just decided. This is a whole bunch of people, typically. And the other one was that they hadn't made the decision to change the way they do business that day. So this sort of decision had been implemented typically long, long ago, but in a different context. When we talk about mishaps, we're looking for, that anomaly thing. Stuff that just comes up on a safety investigation board like, hey, has anything like this ever happened again? Well, there's this one time, when we're talking about John S. McCain. This was not the first or the second or the 14th time on John S. McCain that the operator was not able to gang the throttle successfully on the first try on that display. But who knew? The information about this thing happened never made it any higher. So the only real difference between the near miss day on John McCain and the mishap day on John McCain was two very small things. One was they had their automatic information systems tuned so they were only looking forward to the beam for contacts. And at this time that this occurred, they just happened to have a ship that was less than a couple hundred yards away on the side where they didn't gang the throttle. So those two minor things were the difference between 10 lives lost and nothing bad happened. These mishap boards called this out in their reports. That's why we had an artifact to look at, because the condition of these logs or records was insufficient to be able to reconstruct the mishap. What I asked my prospective commanding officers is, why do we keep logs in the United States Navy anyway? And they come up with reasons like, we're required to, for trend analysis, engineers say that, or so we can recreate a mishap. The basic fundamental thing I try to convince them of this, logs and records are a most basic supervisory measure in the Navy. They verified that the person who's supposed to looked at the thing they were supposed to at the time they were supposed to, recorded its actual value, and took action it required. And if you think about it like that, of what value are all the supervisory measures that we layer on top of that if our most basic one is disregarded or dysfunctional? What we found in each one of our cases in the mishaps was that the crew knew some facts, and they did a very nice brief that ended up with an operational risk management slide that says, here's all the mitigations we're going to apply. But the problem was that that thing they knew about was never discussed in terms of what are we going to physically do about it. And the example I give is Antietam, which is they had a beautiful graph with here the ship's going to come out, they're going to turn right, they're going to this point. They even showed that the winds were going to be coming from the port beam. But there was no discussion at any point in the planning or the briefings about how they were going to steer the ship differently or apply power differently to counteract the fact that as they slowed, these uncontrollable forces were going to have a larger and larger effect. There was a thing that you knew about, but you tried to cover it in a slide that says, well, the captain's going to be on the bridge, or we'll do a great job of backing each other up, or combat system's going to give us readbacks on our course corrections. That's all wonderful, but that's not what you're going to do. I'm talking about how you're physically going to control your environment. And that's what was missing in many of our mishaps. One of the things to know about ships is your teammates, you may never even meet those people, depending on how large the ship is. But they come from many departments, divisions, they're back in engineering, they're up on the bridge, in the middle in combat systems, and everywhere in between. And what we saw in our mishap events was that team coordination piece that often is mandated, so it's kind of like a procedure, did not occur. I give the example of Fitzgerald. The question is, why did Fitzgerald run into that ship? And the answer is because they didn't see it, or they didn't see it in time. And there's a series of whys, which ends up with big radar was off, it was dark, maybe I had lookouts in the wrong place. So it all came down to, what about that surface search radar? Well, it was in long pulse mode, so we couldn't break out all the ships. Okay, why? Well, the switch up here we used to switch that back and forth between modes is broken. It's been that way for a while. Is there any other way to change modes on the radar? Well, you can go down to the rack in combat systems and push the button and change modes on the radar. Well, why didn't that happen? Well, and completely paraphrasing, but it's things along the lines of, as an operations specialist, so one of our enlisted rates, when I call down the electronics technicians and tell them to change modes on the radar, they tell me I'm stupid. Or they say, hey, I'll get to it when I can, or hey, I gotta check with chief first, or, why don't you come down and do it yourself, or any of another sort of answers. And one of the things that Admiral Davidson asked us at the comprehensive review is, do you believe that every sailor understands that they each have a personal responsibility for some aspect of safety of navigation of the ship? And the answer is, at the time, was no, or they lose track of it at some point. So it becomes this idea of I'm doing something for you, as opposed to this is my job. And the last of the 6 common traits of the ship says these ships were above average, which is true in many regards, that the ways that we had assessed them externally. John S. McCain scored the highest score ever achieved by any ship in the surface force in the last 5 years on this thing called a Type Commander Material Inspection in just the weeks prior to their mishap. And yet they failed. It's this perspective that not all of our measures are perfect, particularly when we come to looking at risk. So it does express 2 things. One is we have to measure it better, and the other one is we have to figure out if we're assessing the right things.
How do we set conditions so that we are successful, both when we are operating a more technical maneuver and exercise, like getting into port and getting out is supposed to be, and also successful when unexpected things happen and we have to quickly try to understand, how is this different than what we thought? And why is it going wrong, and what can we do about that? Because almost all of the problems that we're going to have are going to be these more routine, more standard problems that will respond to command and control. And all of the most important problems we're going to have are going to be problems where there's some unexpected component.
One thing you see throughout the force is, I think, the emotional intelligence is getting stronger. The ability to understand that we're being called upon to be more than just the chess masters, but also the gardeners, right? And tending to the individuals so that we can raise that ceiling of what a unit and what a crew is capable of doing. That's where our heart lies in a lot of these endeavors, and why I'm really excited that the Navy continues, and the surface community specifically, is taking this challenge on.
The Navy's over 200 years old. Culture change takes time. But in my 3 years of doing this job, I have seen remarkable change in a lot of these leaders' attitudes, and so I'm very encouraged by that.
It's encouraging that we are now considering real solutions for the Navy, enhanced ability to monitor and manage sleep and fatigue-related data, as well as training and education. The other part of this is to create a culture around these principles. My sailors are going to eat well. My sailors are going to have time to sleep and get high-quality sleep when they can. My sailors are going to have opportunity to work out and get that activity. Providing that psychological safety, there's not going to be any negative consequences if you actually do go work out.
Peak performance, I think that's a critical component to this entire process. It's not at the expense of readiness or the expense of anything else. It is readiness. It is ensuring that our force is more prepared to take on the challenges that we have yet to face.
And I'm hoping part of the organizational change will come when we organize and advertise this way of thinking to the junior sailors. It's almost validating for folks who are out there just barely hanging on because of the operational tempo being so high. They're probably going to be happy to hear that we're recognizing that it's not just failing on their part that are going to lead to bad outcomes.
Now, when this documentary is played, in the comment section, stand by. But I know far more sailors who are getting the care they need. The Navy is taking care of them. Leaders will go to the ends of the earth to get them the help they need and try to save their careers.
There is a thought that when orders are issued, orders are followed. But the answer is, for those orders to be truly effectively executed, they have to trust you.
It's about toughness, trust, and connectedness. And when we take better care of each other, then it becomes a lot easier to get the mission done too.
We've never been more prepared to look in the mirror and see what's wrong and fix it than we are right now. We have got to invest in our people and the infrastructure so that they can live reasonably, whether it's on the ground or at sea. We have to do it. We have no choice.
That is our role in Congress, in my opinion, is to make sure that the Navy has the resources that they need to make sure they can protect us. Let's forget about the blame game for a moment and let's just fix the problem so it doesn't happen again.
That's the part I'm encouraged about is, well short of 7 years, we started to see changes in some of these behaviors, like how much sleep people are getting and what we're finding and what we're learning. What Congress can do, what crews can do, what force commanders can do are all different things. What I really love is the idea that these things are not safety issues, they're just how we do business. What somebody else does as part of their job. We no longer attach the idea of somehow safety is different, but it's just what we do. Victory.